In the dim, suffocating silence of the Hotel St. Paul, a man sits motionless on a throne of velvet and gold. He doesn't speak, barely dares to breathe. His eyes, wide and rimmed red from sleeplessness, dart frantically across the room, tracking every servant, every curtain, every shadow. This is Charles VI, ruler of France, the most powerful monarch in Europe. But in this room, in 1405, he's not a king. He's a prisoner of terror so absolute, it's frozen him in place. He believes he's stopped being a man of flesh and bone. He believes his ribs, his spine, his hips have turned into brittle, transparent glass. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer physical horror of that. Looking down at your own hands and seeing skin, but feeling only the cold, unforgiving fragility of a wine goblet. Believing that a single stumble, a sudden cough, or the accidental brush of a courtier's sleeve wouldn't just bruise you, it would shatter you. He believes that if he falls, he won't bleed. He'll burst into 1,000 irreparable shards on the stone floor. So he doesn't move. For hours, he stays rigid, muscles locked in a painful spasm of control. When exhaustion finally forces him to shift, he does it with the agonizing slowness of someone defusing a bomb. He refuses to bathe. The water might crack him. Refuses to change his clothes. The friction might be too much for his glass skin to bear. The air in the royal chambers grows heavy and stale, smelling of sweat and neglect. But the king doesn't care. Hygiene is for the living. Survival is the only concern for the fragile. His paranoia manifests in iron. He summons the royal tailors, voice trembling, and issues a command that sounds like madness to their ears, but like salvation to his. He demands armor, not for war, for existence, orders them to sew thick, heavy iron ribs into the lining of his clothes. Demands reinforced padding, layers upon layers of wool and leather, creating a soft cage to hold his brittle body together. When he finally walks the corridors, he looks less like a monarch and more like a scavenging beast, wrapped in rags and metal, flinching at the air itself. He clutches his torso, knuckles white, feeling for the iron rods that keep him whole. The court watches in horrified silence. They see tragedy, a ruler who's lost his mind. But Charles doesn't see madness. He sees a world filled with hammers. Every hard surface, every heavy door, every stone step is a weapon waiting to unmake him. The tragedy of the Glass King isn't just that he's mad. It's that his madness has stripped him of the one thing a king requires: human connection. He screams if his wife approaches, cowers if his children try to embrace him. He's called the Beloved. Yet he can't be touched. He's entirely, devastatingly alone within the transparent prison of his own mind. But the glass didn't appear overnight. Before the silence, there was noise. Before the fragility, there was iron will. To understand how a king becomes a vessel of glass, we need to look back to the moment the cracks first began to show. Long before the iron ribs, back when the only weight he carried was a crown that was far too heavy for a boy to wear.
To understand the shattered man huddled in the dark, we must look at the boy standing in the light. Long before the iron ribs and the terror of glass, Charles was a child of 11 years, standing in the vast, echoing nave of Rheims Cathedral. The year was 1380. The air smelled of incense and cold stone. As the archbishop lowered the heavy gold crown onto his small head, Charles was not just accepting a title, he was accepting a curse. The France he inherited was not a stable paradise. It was a bleeding wound. The 100 Years' War with England had already ravaged the countryside for decades. The treasury was empty, the people were starving, and the English armies were a constant, looming storm on the horizon. For a grown man, this political landscape would have been a nightmare. For a boy who had just lost his father, it was an impossible burden. But the danger did not only come from across the channel. It sat at his own dinner table. Because Charles was a minor, he could not rule alone. The government was seized by his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Anjou, and Bourbon. History often paints regents as wise protectors, but these men were vultures circling a fresh kill. They did not care for the boy king, nor did they care for France. They saw the crown as a key to the treasury, and they turned the lock. They drained the kingdom's finances to fund their own lavish courts and private wars. They imposed crushing taxes on a peasantry that was already eating grass to survive. Riots broke out in the streets of Paris, the revolt of the Marottins, where desperate citizens armed with lead mallets slaughtered tax collectors. The young king watched from his palace windows as his capital burned, his uncles whispering poison in his ears, teaching him that to rule was to be feared, not loved. Charles inherited a broken kingdom at 11 years old. Do you think the human mind is built to carry the weight of an entire nation at such an age? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. For 8 long years, the boy watched the theft of his realm. But Charles was not weak. He was observant. In 1388, at the age of 20, he did something extraordinary. He walked into the council chamber, looked his powerful uncles in the eye, and thanked them for their service. Then, he dismissed them. He took the reins of power into his own hands. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like a fairy tale. Charles recalled his father's old advisors, the marmozets, and began to repair the damage. He lowered taxes. He sought peace with England. He threw festivals that brought light back to a gloomy Paris. The people, so used to suffering, looked up at their young, handsome monarch and wept with relief. They gave him a new name, Charles le Bien-Aimé. Charles the Beloved. He was the golden prince who had saved France from its own greed. He was the perfect king. But beneath the velvet robes and the cheering crowds, the stress was boiling. He was working himself to the bone, traveling constantly, negotiating treaties, and looking over his shoulder for the uncles who were plotting their return. The human mind is resilient, but like a dam holding back a flood, it can only withstand so much pressure before the structural integrity begins to fail. The cracks were there, invisible to the naked eye, running deep through the foundation of his psyche. All it would take was one hot summer day, one moment of absolute exhaustion, for the dam to break and the floodwaters to drown the beloved king forever. The summer of 1392 descended upon France not with the warmth of the sun, but with the weight of an anvil. It was August, the kind of stifling, airless month where the heat radiates from the earth itself, turning the air into a shimmering haze. The king's army was marching west towards Brittany, a sprawling column of steel and horseflesh winding through the ancient forest of Le Mans. Charles rode at the head of the column. He was dressed in a heavy jacket of black velvet and a scarlet cap, garments that trapped the heat against his skin like a furnace. He was already unwell. His face was pale, slick with sweat, and his eyes were glazed, staring at things no one else could see. The pressure of the crown, the betrayals of his uncles, and the endless days of riding had worn his nerves down to the width of a spider's silk. The forest around them was silent, save for the rhythmic thud of hooves and the buzzing of cicadas, a relentless, drilling sound that seemed to bore straight into the king's skull. Suddenly, a figure burst from the tree line. It was a man in rags, barefooted and wild-eyed, looking more like a corpse dug up from the earth than a living soul. He rushed the royal procession, dodging the startled guards, and seized the bridle of the king's horse. The army froze. In the terrifying silence of the forest, the madman's voice rang out, cracking with desperation. "Ride no further, noble king," he screamed, his spittle flying into the humid air. "Turn back! You are betrayed!" The king's bodyguards descended on the man instantly, beating him back with the shafts of their spears, driving him back into the shadows of the woods. But they did not kill him. Whether out of superstition or simple shock, they let the ragged prophet vanish back into the trees. But the damage was done. The words hung in the air like smoke. Betrayed. Charles said nothing. He did not ask who the man was. He did not order a pursuit. He simply sat on his horse, his chest heaving, his knuckles white on the reins. The seed of paranoia, planted by his uncles years ago, had just been watered. The forest was no longer a road, it was a trap. Every tree hid an assassin. Every shadow held a knife. The march continued, but the rhythm had changed. The air felt tighter, charged with an electric, unspoken violence. The sun climbed higher, baking the men in their armor. The king drifted into a strange, waking slumber, his head lolling as the heat stroke and exhaustion clawed at his sanity. Then, the world shattered. A young page, drowsy from the heat, lost his grip on his lance. The heavy iron weapon slipped from his hand and struck the steel helmet of another soldier with a sharp, piercing clang. In the quiet of the forest, the noise was as loud as a cannon shot. Charles snapped. His eyes flew open, but the man who looked out from them was gone. In his place was a creature of pure, animalistic terror. He drew his sword with a scream that chilled the blood of every knight within earshot. Forward against the traitors, he roared, spurring his horse into a frenzy. They wish to deliver me to my enemies. Before anyone could react, the King of France charged his own men. He swung his blade with the strength of a man possessed, striking down the bastard of Polignac. He turned on the next knight, and the next, slashing wildly at the very people sworn to protect him. Panic erupted. The column dissolved into chaos. "The king is dead," someone shouted. "The king is mad," screamed another. His knights scattered, terrified, but they could not fight back. This was their anointed sovereign, God's chosen ruler. To raise a sword against him was damnation. They could only dodge his blows and pray. For an hour, the king raged through the forest, hunting his own shadow. He killed for men. He chased his own brother, the Duke of Orleans, through the trees, intent on murder. It was only when his sword finally shattered from the force of his blows, and his horse collapsed from exhaustion, that his chamberlain was able to tackle him from behind. They pinned him to the forest floor, weeping as they restrained him. Charles lay still, his eyes rolling back into his head, foaming at the mouth. He did not know where he was. He did not know who he was. The beloved king had died in that forest. What woke up days later, bound in a wagon rattling back to Paris, was something else entirely. The man of glass had been born. Paris, January 1393. The air was cold, but inside the Hotel St. Paul, the atmosphere was feverish with forced celebration. The king had returned from the forest of Le Mans broken, but after months of rest, the doctors declared him lucid. The court, desperate to believe the nightmare was over, decided to do what the French court did best: they threw a party. A masquerade ball to celebrate a lady-in-waiting's wedding. But this was no ordinary dance. The king and 5 of his closest noble companions decided to perform a charivari, a wild, raucous dance where they dress as woodwoses, mythical savage men of the forest. To achieve the look, they were sewn into linen suits soaked in resin, covered in pitch, and coated in frayed flax. They looked like beasts. But practically speaking, they were walking wicks. The costumes were so flammable that a strict order went out to the entire hall: no torches near the dancers. The room was to be lit only by the distant chandeliers on the walls. For a time, it worked. The 6 savages burst into the hall, howling and leaping, their identities hidden behind masks. The court laughed. The music swelled. The king, hidden among his friends, felt a rare moment of joy. He was anonymous. Free. Then the doors swung open. The king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, arrived late. Drunk, accompanied by a retinue of knights, and ignoring the strict orders, carrying a blazing torch. He wanted to see who was hiding beneath the flax. He stepped onto the dance floor, pushing through the crowd, laughing as he lowered the flame toward one of the dancers to inspect his face. A single spark was all it took. The flax caught instantly. Didn't just burn, exploded. Because the costumes were soaked in resin and pitch, the fire didn't sit on the surface. It melted into the fabric and fused to skin. The dancer screamed. The fire jumped to the man next to him, then the next. Within seconds, 4 of the 6 dancers were human pillars of fire, thrashing blindly in the center of the hall. The music stopped. Laughter died in a collective gasp of horror. The room filled with the smell of burning hair and roasting meat. The dancers couldn't strip off the costumes, they were sewn in. They ran screaming toward the guests, begging for help, but the courtiers recoiled, terrified the flames would spread to their own silks and velvets. Charles was separated from the group. He stood alone, watching his friends burn. Saw the Count of Joigny, a young man he'd grown up with, consumed by the inferno. Saw the bastard son of Foy wailing as the pitch boiled on his skin. The king froze. The old terror from the forest rushed back. The fire was the dragon, the demon, the punishment for his sins. He would have burned with them if not for the quick thinking of the Duchess of Berry. She was only 15, but she recognized the king. Grabbed him, threw her heavy skirt over his head and body to shield him from the sparks, and tackled him to the floor. "Do not move, sire," she whispered, holding him down as the screams echoed around them. For half an hour, the king lay in the dark beneath her dress, listening to the death throes of his companions. One dancer saved himself by jumping into a vat of wine. The other 4 burned to death in front of the entire court. When the smoke finally cleared, Charles emerged from his hiding place. Physically unharmed, but the man who stood up wasn't the same man who'd laid down. The fragility was back. The glass had returned. He'd seen the world turn into hell in a heartbeat, and his mind retreated permanently into the safety of delusion. History is full of these dark corners. If you appreciate untold stories told in the quiet, subscribe to the Hushed Archives. Join us as we open the next record. The Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men, was the final blow. The king locked himself in his chambers. Refused to wash, fearing water was a form of fire. Refused to change his clothes. And most importantly, he began to feel the hardening of his own skin, the terrifying clarity that he was no longer made of flesh, but of something far more breakable. The fire at the masquerade did not kill the king, but it burned away the last remnants of his reason. In the months that followed, the Hotel St. Paul ceased to be a palace and became a laboratory for the grotesque. The finest physicians in Europe flocked to Paris, their robes trailing across the stone floors, their bags filled with saws, drills, and vials of mercury. They did not see a man suffering from trauma, they saw a vessel corrupted by evil humors. To cure the mind, they attacked the body. They believed the king's brain was swollen with bile, pressing against his skull. The solution was brutal and direct: trepanation. They shaved the head of the most powerful man in Christendom and bored holes into his skull with hand-cranked drills, hoping to release the pressure. They bled him until he was pale as linen. They purged him with toxic concoctions of hellebore and vinegar. When the knives and leeches failed to bring him back, the court turned to darker methods. If medicine could not reach him, perhaps magic could. 2 Augustinian monks were summoned from Guyenne, men who claimed to speak the language of demons. They were given free rein over the monarch. For weeks, the palace echoed with the sounds of their incantations. They made incisions in the king's scalp and implanted small iron pearls, claiming they were holy relics that would draw out the madness. They forced him to drink distillations of powdered pearls and water from sacred wells. But the king did not improve. He only retreated further into the shadows, a victim of both his disease and his doctors. The man who eventually emerged from these treatments was a stranger. One morning, Charles woke up and looked at the woman sitting by his bedside, Isabeau of Bavaria, his wife and the mother of his children. He recoiled in disgust. "Who is this woman?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why does she look at me so? Get her out of my sight." He had forgotten his name. He had forgotten his children. He had forgotten the war. In the void where his memory used to be, a new, terrifying reality took root. The delusion of glass returned, stronger than ever before. It was no longer a fleeting fear, it was a physical certainty. He stopped moving entirely. He stood for hours in the corner of his room, terrified that if he sat down, his buttocks would shatter like a dropped vase. He summoned his tailors again, but this time, he did not ask for silk or velvet. He demanded a new skin. He ordered them to construct a suit of clothes reinforced with iron ribs, long, curved metal rods sewn directly into the lining of his coats and trousers. He required them to stitch thick leather pads into his doublets, creating a buffer between his fragile glass body and the hard, uncompromising world. When he did walk, he moved with a terrifying, mechanical stiffness, the iron ribs clanking softly against each other with every step. He became a prisoner in his own armor, a king who could not be hugged, could not be held, and could not be touched. He forbade the servants from brushing against him. He ate his meals standing up. He was the ruler of France, yet he spent his days terrified of the floor, the walls, and the very air that surrounded him. The sorcerers were eventually beheaded for their failure, their heads mounted on pikes at the gates of Paris. But the iron ribs remained. They were the only things holding the king together, a metal cage for a soul that had already broken into 1,000 pieces. While the king huddled in the darkened corners of the Hotel St. Paul, whispering to his iron ribs and cowering from the touch of his own servants, the kingdom beyond his walls began to fracture. A monarch is the keystone of a nation. When he cracks, the arch can't hold. With Charles lost to his delusions, a vacuum of power opened in the heart of Paris. A void quickly filled by wolves. The uncles he'd once dismissed returned with a vengeance. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans tore the country apart in a vicious civil war, fighting for control of the puppet king. The streets of Paris ran red with blood, but Charles saw none of it. He was fighting his own war against the invisible hammers he believed were waiting to shatter him. He signed whatever papers were placed before him, his trembling hand guided by men who viewed him not as a sovereign, but as a rubber stamp. It was this paralysis, this hollow throne, that invited the ultimate predator. Across the Channel, the young and ambitious Henry V of England saw a France that was decapitated. A glass king. In 1415, while Charles was locked in a manic episode shouting at the walls, the English army crushed the French nobility at the Battle of Agincourt. The flower of French chivalry died in the mud, leaderless, because their king was too terrified to wear his armor. The invasion was a deluge. The English swept through Normandy, capturing town after town. They marched on Paris, and there was no one to stop them. The tragedy of Charles VI isn't just that he lost his mind, it's that his madness cost him his legacy. In 1420, in a moment of supreme humiliation, the mad king was manipulated into signing the Treaty of Troyes. With a single stroke of a quill, he disinherited his own son, the Dauphin, and named Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. The man who'd been crowned the Beloved had just signed his country's death warrant. He'd given France away. By the end of his life, Charles was a ghost haunting his own palace. The Beloved was gone, replaced by a filthy, neglected old man with wild grey hair and clothes that hadn't been changed in weeks. His wife had abandoned him for the luxury of the English court. His children were scattered or dead. The servants, unpaid and unsupervised, often forgot to bring him food. He wandered the draughty corridors of St. Paul, a shriveled figure wrapped in iron and rags, muttering to himself about the fragility of the world. In October 1422, the end finally came. Charles VI succumbed to a fever. He died as he'd lived for 30 years, alone, terrified, and broken. His funeral was a stark contrast to the glory of his coronation. No cheering crowds, no weeping subjects lining the streets to touch the hem of his garment. The people of Paris were too exhausted by war and famine to mourn. As his coffin was lowered into the crypt at St. Denis, it wasn't the burial of a great king, it was the disposal of a tragedy. His reign had begun with the promise of a golden age and ended in the mud of Agincourt and the ink of a surrender treaty. He left behind a France that was physically shattered, split between the English north and the loyalist south, a map that mirrored the fractured landscape of his own mind. The irony of his life is absolute. Charles spent 30 years terrified that his body would break into shards of glass. In the end, his body remained whole, but it was his kingdom, his dynasty, and his legacy that shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces on the floor of history. The Glass King shattered, and his country fell with him. But the archives hold more secrets. Click the video on your screen to explore the tragic life of the Veiled Empress.